Hello, everybody. Thank you for your time and your attention. I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate your commitment to learning more about ethical AI, especially in machine learning teams. I'm sure there's no one in this room that doesn't know what AI is, what AI ethics is. I'm sure that you have an idea, you've heard about it, responsible AI. These are concepts that are familiar to you. We just want to go a little bit more in depth and talk about some ways you can realize AI ethics in a very practical sense. Awesome. So just a little bit more about me, although Chris did a great job of introducing myself. I'm a futurist and an entrepreneur. My work is at the intersection of innovation, inclusion, and ethics. I'm really committed to kind of balancing innovation with social responsibility. I do this work because I envision a future where human-machine collaboration is ethical, safe, and human-centered. So let me start with a question. Who owns AI ethics in your organization? Is it the data scientist? Is it legal? Is it leadership? In practice, most people, when I ask them this question, will point to someone else, right? It's not really my responsibility. I kind of just do product. I kind of just do engineering. But the reality is ethical AI is no singular person's responsibility. It's a team sport. And if you don't design for it, it doesn't happen. Let me give you an example. I once spoke to a team shipping a recommendation algorithm, and nobody knew who was responsible for user safety. The product manager assumed that it was engineering. Engineering thought it was legal. And weeks later, when a complaint came in about biased outcomes, everyone was surprised. Nobody had said anything. Nobody had raised a red flag. So today we're going to talk about how to structure accountability inside technical teams and how you as practitioners, varying from leadership, organizational, or the organizational level, or engineering and development, how you can actively shape responsible AI and not just respond to it. So think back to your last project. Who brought up ethics? And what happened next? Most organizations treat ethics like an afterthought, something that we think about after deployment. After a press line, after a regulator comes knocking. But here's the thing with AI. Ethical decisions happen at every step. So when you choose a data source, when you define success metrics, when you optimize for one variable over the other, every one of these choices has real-world consequences. Think about Amazon's hiring algorithm, or even Workday's, how it degraded resumes with female indicators, or even facial recognition algorithms and systems that perform poorly on darker skin tones. These outcomes were not accidents. They were rooted in early design decisions. So let's visualize the life cycle. Data sourcing, labeling, model design, evaluation, and then deployment, right? Every step has ethical inflection points, and yet we often don't treat them in this way. We treat them as technical decisions when in fact they're ethical ones as well. This disconnect leads to what is considered check the box ethics, which is quite performative, right? We are doing things and we're checking off things on a list, but we're not actually shaping behavior. If ethics lives in a compliance document and not in your sprint planning, you've missed the moment. Let's talk about governance. There are three main models I see organizations using to manage responsible AI. So there's the centralized model. This is when there's a dedicated responsible AI or Office of Ethics. This is great because the expertise is consolidated. You have a group of specialists, presumably law, philosophy, governance, and everybody really deeply understands the risks and the frameworks. There's clear accountability. It's quite defined. It's easier to get consistent policies and guardrails across teams. The con with this approach is that there's a bit of a detachment from the everyday work. You know, that team, the ethics team sits here and product sits over here, and it becomes a little bit abstract and disconnected, like I mentioned. There's also sometimes a bit of bottlenecking that happens where we're waiting for the ethics team or the responsible AI, council to make decisions. And sometimes this is viewed as red tape, and nobody wants to actually really engage. There's the embedded model, and this is great because you are able to be a little bit more agile. You're not waiting for approvals. Everybody is working together, and ethics lives inside a product team or a development team. This is great for building a culture of ownership where everybody feels a little bit of responsibility to ethics and building responsible AI. Sometimes it's tough with this model because there's no central guidance. It's quite dispersed, and so sometimes it's easier for people to feel like, well, I'm not fully responsible, or I'm not really responsible. Look at all these other people who are also, supposed to be a part of this. And so there's another model, which is the federated model. And this is where cross-functional groups share responsibility. This is a great approach. And each of these approaches, obviously, they have their pros and their cons. There's no right or wrong. It depends on so many factors: the size of your team, access to resources, and so on and so forth. This is a great option because you're able to kind of balance both depth and breadth. So you have folks from legal, from tech, from design. There's flexibility. People are working together. Some of the downsides of this one are, again, there's no one that's fully accountable. Sometimes that diffusion of responsibility works counterintuitive to what we're trying to accomplish. And this model is also very dependent on the culture. If there is psychological safety in that culture, if there is a culture of collaboration, these pieces are key for the federated model. So of course, you want to choose based off of value, but also being very intentional. Considering your culture, like I mentioned, psychological safety is so important. If you are a startup with a team of 5, how do you decide who is going to be responsible for ethics? Who's going to be responsible for raising red flags? Who is going to take on that responsibility, or for lack of a better term, perhaps that burden, right? The key is being intentional about the design. And if you don't assign responsibility, it tends to fall through the cracks. So what do effective responsible AI teams actually do? What does it look like in practice? They are cross-functional. You have model developers, you've got legal, you've got user experience, and if you're lucky, you also have a dedicated responsible AI lead. Wrong slide, that's okay. These teams, they ritualize ethics in an operational way. So there's ethical pre-mortems. This is when we're asking what could go wrong before it does, right? Model cards, documentation gates, red teaming, actively looking for failures before launch. Picture a launch meeting. The model is 85% accurate. Everyone's eager to ship. Who asks, should we launch this right now? And what might we be missing? Good teams bake these check-ins in. They have documentation. They create decision gates. And they don't just ask if the model works. They ask who the model works for. Even small teams can do this. All it takes is somebody willing to say, wait, let's stress test this first. So the good news is you don't need an ethicist to do this work, although it's helpful. As practitioners, you already make high impact decisions. As business leaders, you make high impact decisions every day. You need tools to help you surface the ethical decisions that are facing you. So what you can do is ask second order questions. Who might this exclude? What happens if this scales? And what assumptions are we making right now that might not hold true in the real world? That is a big one that is often overlooked. It works well in the lab, in a very fixed environment that's very predictable. But when we go to the real world, things are not exactly the same. So things we can do, we can use lightweight tools, ethical checklists, documentation templates, peer reviews, and impact canvases. It's important to think past just tools and also really consider the culture. Whenever we approach responsible AI in an organization, we're approaching it from both a technical and an organizational lens. Both need to come together for this to be successful. Ethical awareness is a muscle, and you need to exercise it. The more you exercise it, the more your team will do it. You have to get started. It's not going to happen if you don't. And you don't want to wait until the stakes are so high that there's so much pressure for you to make the right decision or, XYZ consequence. You want to get started right away at the smallest inflection points, at the smallest opportunities. One of the major pitfalls to avoid here is delegating ethics to legal or leadership, like we mentioned. They play a role, but the people that are closest to the model have the greatest influence. And so the point of design is the point of impact. Think of a time that you flagged a concern. What happened? And if you did, and if you didn't, why didn't you? Right? So to wrap up, ethics is not someone else's job, it's everyone's job. I know that sounds cliche, but it quite actually is the truth. We covered why ethics needs to move upstream in AI workflows. We talked about different governance models and some of the pros and cons of each. We talked about what effective responsible AI teams look like and how you can lead and start from where you are. So let me leave you with this quote from Justice Potter Stewart. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have the right to do and what is right to do. So we've covered quite a bit in a short amount of time. Hopefully, great takeaways and highlights. Different governance models, you need to consider what works for your organization, what is most accessible. Think about other responsible AI teams, model what they look like, learn from peers, and think about where you can start and how you can lead. Responsible AI is not about slowing down. It's about building things that last. This idea that if you build proper guardrails, then you can move faster. And so the next time somebody asks who owns AI ethics, you can confidently say, we all do. Thank you so much.
Awesome stuff. Thank you, Rose. Okay, guys. Again, we have a mic runner who's going to be able to bring the mic right to you if you have a question. If you do have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll airlift the mic to you so that we can all hear.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a really good presentation. I think you hit it on the nail around responsible AI and data ethics. My question for you is, what advice would you give to like a data quality team? Team like ideally, would create dashboards around data quality. How would you see data quality evolving to be like a foundational element around responsible AI and data ethics?
That's a great question. I think that, like we mentioned, there's an opportunity in all the work that we do at each step of building a product that uses AI for us to consider ethics. I think when we're talking about data, we can learn a lot from data ethics. We're considering bias in the data, how we display the data, how we explain decisions that are made using that data. I think there's things that we can pull from industries that have existed from forever, like accessibility, right? That plays into responsible AI and the ethics and the principles around explainability, interpretability, fairness, as well as accountability.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. I'm just wondering, have you seen any approaches or let's say templates, rituals for how technical and non-technical teams overcome language barriers or priority barriers in responsible AI?
Templates, yes. You know, there's templates, there's frameworks, there's guidelines. I think one of the pieces that is really going to help in that regard is, like I mentioned, you know, ethics by design from the very beginning, having it as a priority from the moment there's a decision to work on this project, in addition to, you know, kind of sharing the responsibility across the team so that that technical side and that organizational side are both being considered. Another piece is, like I mentioned, kind of this culture, making sure people feel comfortable to raise questions and to kind of challenge each other, right? Nobody feels like you're stepping on their foot because you're not technical and they are, and you know, these types of things. So building that culture, making use of, like you mentioned, frameworks, guidelines, templates, and you know, really approaching it from, like you said, that technical and organizational.
Hi, again, like everyone, thank you so much for the really interesting presentation. My question is, what advice would you give organizations that maybe are just starting on their data and AI transformation journeys or have a really small data team on how to get the buy-in or the resources that they need in order to be able to prioritize responsible and ethical AI development? For instance, you know, you said hiring a dedicated RAI lead, or maybe getting data literacy training for their workforce.
Yeah, that's a great question, and what you just mentioned is what I was going to say. What we often see is a great way to get started is that literacy piece, just kind of educating people on why it's important, why it matters. I think there's this feeling of, you know, I use AI in my personal life, and you know, therefore I, you know enough, or I know all there is to know, you know, in a sense. It's easy to overestimate kind of the depth of our knowledge on something. And so when you start with training, it really kind of illuminates it. You can drive the point home. And then we find from there, it's much easier to get that buy-in.
Sure. Thank you, Rose. Fantastic talk. I'm a professor at Northeastern University. I teach data science. What would you recommend for students to start thinking about ethics in AI, and especially for data science students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would start thinking about data sources. I would start thinking about bias in data. I would start thinking about quality of data, representation in data. I would, again, kind of really borrow from data ethics and lean on the importance of data being one of the most important kind of pieces of machine learning as it relates to developing AI models. So really kind of, I think, making people feel empowered that they can really impact and shape and you know, change the way that things are done. And then, you know, like I said, have them start to think about some of those concepts, really consider borrowing from the more established field of data ethics.
Hi, Rose. Thank you so much for your presentation. Similar question to the one previously asked, but I'm a medical student at the University of Toronto, and with how quickly these models are starting to get integrated into our clinical workflow, it's something that I've thought about quite a bit. So do you have any words of advice for somebody trying to navigate responsible AI as a student?
Yes, I would say ask many questions. Question things that seem to be commonplace, or you know, we've always done it that way. Be very curious. I think take a lens on if I looked different, or if I was a different person, if I lived in a different part of the world, if I had a different, level of education, how would this affect me? How would this change outcomes or how I interact with this? And so kind of use a curiosity mindset, I think is the best piece of advice I could give.
Hi, Rose. Mark Donaldson, founder and CEO of Quantuity Analytics. I'm also an alum of TMU from the Ted Rogers School of Management, BCom, BTM. I also have a minor in Chinese language and cultural studies. My question to you is, like yourself being a person of color, is there a personal connection why you chose to focus on AI governance, especially around data that does have a lot of inherent biases to them, and introducing new biases to make them more compliant or more symmetrical versus an asymmetrical bias?
Yeah, I think that it's impossible to ignore how my identity shapes my lived experience and what things interest me. I did a certificate in ethics actually at TMU through the philosophy department over 10 years ago. It was on the genealogy of morality was what my thesis was on. And so I've always been very curious about ethics and thinking about that lens, how different people experience the world. And so when, generative AI kind of really burst onto the scene, it was very natural to start to consider, okay, how does this impact people differently? And in what ways can we make the changes that we want to see? And the one thing that I continuously come back to is being intentional. If we're not intentional, we really risk falling into a reality or into a future that we don't prefer. And we have the choice to make that change and to make that decision every single day.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. My question is around the overlap between responsible AI and environmental sustainability. So how do you think about ethics in the context of sustainability and responsibility to the environment?
And it comes up often, as it should. There are kind of, two schools of thought when I think about this. We think about the intensive resource requirements that AI has, and the infrastructure around AI, and what possible futures we're moving towards if we start to compete with AI for energy, resources, water, and that sort of thing. There's this other perspective where we think about AI as an optimizer, and that AI may find more efficient and effective ways for us to share energy in future, and we can use this power to kind of solve some of our sustainability concerns and address them. And I think that, with the latter, this can happen again if we're intentional, if we decide this is one of the ways that we want to use AI. For the former, if we are if we're not intentional, and if we're not kind of optimizing for, I think, alignment and other things like that, we could, find ourselves in a future that we don't prefer.
Hi, Rose. Fantastic talk. I have this question. I've been to multiple conferences when people talk about ethical AI, responsible AI, but I heard multiple narratives. So as a person who is practicing this and providing services to different organizations, do you see a convergence between different narratives of what is ethical AI? Like, for example, the previous question, when it comes to environmental sustainability, different people have opinions. And what you may be considering ethical AI may be okay for somebody else. So is there a pattern? Is it a global pattern, or do you see things converging? Where is it going?
Yeah, that's a great observation, a great question. I think that there are different areas that are focused on depending on many different factors. I think geography is a very big consideration here, depending on where somebody is situated. Asking questions about ethics, they might lean more towards sustainability if they're already in a water-constrained area. If they, I think that there's so much that shapes the way that we perceive the world. And so I think there's kind of the underlying foundation of AI ethics when we think about fairness, accountability, transparency. There's a model that has an E in it, and that's for equity or equality. And so I see that as consistent kind of across the board. But where people kind of drill in and focus a little bit more really depends on so many different things. If you're in the, third world country or a developing country rather, you might have different things that you're focused on versus being, in North America. And so there's diversity, of opinion and of attention. But I think that the underlying principles, by and large, remain the same from what I've seen across the board.
Hi, it's a great talk that the ethics need to develop at the same time as our AI method is fast developing. And I'm a biostatistician in the pharma industry. So I know that for the health authority, if they want to approve a drug, they need to be exercising with more caution. If AI is making a mistake, how this would affect the ethics and the patient safety. However, in some other field, like maybe speech recognition, like human brain, they make mistakes. So as long as the AI is performing similar to human, is more acceptable. So how do you see that AI can potentially make mistakes, can affect the ethics and the real world impact based on the different fields? Yeah, this is my question.
Thank you. This is a great question. I think when I think about your question, I think about accountability. When humans make mistakes, we know who to hold accountable. We know how to hold them accountable. When AI makes a mistake, we're still deciding, how we hold and who we hold accountable when AI makes mistakes. And so, of course, the consequences are higher in some of those high risk, scenarios or use cases. But I think that we need to maybe focus less on, is this AI model or is this algorithm or is this approach creating AI that is similar to humans and replicating humans, and focus more on what type of outcome are we trying to achieve? What do we want AI to help us with? And are we doing that successfully? And worry less about, is it human-like? Is it superior to a human? Does it perform better? I think if we shift our focus, we can be more successful in this way.